The spring rain fell softly on Camp Kilmer, New Jersey, turning the dirt roads to mud. It was April 1943, and the war in Europe was raging. Sergeant Helen Morrison stood outside the mess hall, watching young soldiers hurry past with their collars turned up against the weather. At 32 years old, Helen was older than most of the men preparing to ship overseas. She was tall and lean, with dark hair pulled back in regulation style and gray eyes that had seen more than most people twice her age. She joined the Women's Army Corps 6 months earlier, after her husband Tom died at Pearl Harbor. The other soldiers didn't know what to make of her. "There's that whack again," she heard Private Danny Collins mutter to his buddy as they passed. "What's she even doing here? This is a combat training facility." His friend laughed. "Probably filing paperwork or something, that's all they're good for." Helen said nothing. She'd learned that silence was often more powerful than words. She had a job to do, and she intended to do it well, regardless of what these boys thought. Inside the operations building, Colonel James Bradley sat behind his desk, studying a classified report. He looked up when Helen knocked on his open door. "Sergeant Morrison, come in." Helen entered and saluted crisply. "You wanted to see me, sir." Bradley nodded and gestured to a chair. "Sit down, Sergeant. What I'm about to tell you is classified. The information cannot leave this room." Helen sat at attention. "Yes, sir." The colonel pulled out a technical drawing from a locked drawer. It showed a simple weapon, a tube with a trigger mechanism and a crude sight. It looked almost like a toy. "This," Bradley said, "is the M1A1 bazooka. It's a portable anti-tank rocket launcher. Weighs 13 pounds, costs about $20 to manufacture. And our intelligence suggests it could be the most important weapon we send to Europe." Helen studied the drawing carefully. She'd grown up on a farm in Iowa where her father had taught her about machinery and weapons. She understood how things worked, how simple mechanisms could achieve powerful results. "It doesn't look like much, sir," she said honestly. Bradley smiled slightly. "That's exactly the point. The Germans have superior tanks. Their panzers are tearing through our allies' defenses. We need something that ordinary infantry soldiers can use to stop those tanks. This weapon, this cheap, simple weapon, could level the playing field." He paused, looking at her carefully. "The problem is we need to train soldiers to use it effectively, and we need to do it fast. I've read your file, Morrison. Before the war, you were a mechanical engineer. You understand weapons systems, and you're a hell of a shot." Helen felt a flutter of hope in her chest. "Are you offering me a position, sir?" "I'm offering you a challenge," Bradley corrected. "I want you to help develop the training program for the bazooka, work with our weapons specialists, figure out the best tactics, then train the men who'll take this knowledge overseas." He leaned forward. "I won't lie to you, Sergeant. There will be resistance. Most of the men here don't believe women belong in military training. They'll fight you every step of the way. But I need someone smart, someone determined, and someone who understands what's at stake. Are you interested?" Helen didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir, absolutely." The next morning, Helen reported to the weapons testing range. She found 3 men waiting for her: Captain Robert Hayes, a career artillery officer with a weathered face and skeptical eyes; Lieutenant Frank Morrison, no relation; a young West Point graduate who looked barely old enough to shave; and Corporal Mike Chen, a Chinese-American soldier who'd been working with experimental weapons for 2 years. Captain Hayes looked her up and down with barely concealed disdain. "So you're the whack they're sending us. Let me be clear, Sergeant. I requested experienced combat instructors. I got you instead. I'll do my job because those are my orders, but don't expect me to pretend this is anything but a waste of my time." Helen met his gaze steadily. "I don't expect anything from you, Captain, except professionalism. That's all any of us owe each other." Young Lieutenant Morrison snickered. "She's got spirit, I'll give her that, but spirit doesn't stop a panzer." Only Corporal Chen nodded respectfully. "Welcome to the team, Sergeant." They spent the morning reviewing technical specifications. The bazooka was revolutionary in its simplicity. A soldier would load a rocket into the rear of the tube, aim at a tank, and fire. The rocket could penetrate 4 inches of armor at close range, enough to destroy most German tanks. But the weapon had problems. It was inaccurate beyond 50 yards. The backblast could injure anyone standing behind the shooter, and hitting a moving tank required skill, timing, and nerves of steel. "The first thing we need to do," Helen said, studying the weapon, is understand its limitations. We can't train soldiers to use this like a rifle. It's a different animal entirely. Hayes rolled his eyes. Thank you for that insight, Sergeant. I never would have figured that out myself. Helen ignored the sarcasm. Corporal Chen, have you fired this weapon yet? Yes, Sergeant, about 50 test rounds. What's the biggest challenge? Chen considered carefully. The aiming. The rocket drops fast after it leaves the tube. You have to compensate, almost like you're throwing a baseball at a target. It's instinctive, not calculated. Helen nodded. This made sense to her. Her father had taught her to hunt as a child, and she understood the difference between aiming and instinct. Then we need to train that instinct, repetition, muscle memory, just like learning to shoot a basketball. Hayes laughed harshly. This isn't a game, Sergeant Morrison. This is war. These men will be facing tanks that can kill them from 1,000 yards away. They need real training, not your farm girl theories. Something hardened in Helen's chest. She walked to the weapons rack and picked up the bazooka. It was heavier than she expected, but balanced well. Is this weapon loaded? She asked Chen. No, Sergeant. Load it, please. Chen glanced at Captain Hayes, who shrugged. Let her embarrass herself. Might as well get it over with. Chen loaded a practice rocket, a low-velocity training round that wouldn't fly far but would demonstrate the weapon's operation. Downrange, about 40 yards away, sat an old car chassis they'd been using for target practice. Helen hefted the weapon onto her shoulder. She'd studied the manual the previous night, memorizing every detail. She understood the theory. Now she needed to feel the reality. Clear behind, she called, warning everyone to stay away from the backblast. She aimed, using the crude sight to line up the target. Then she hesitated, lowering the weapon slightly. Something felt wrong. Having second thoughts, Hayes asked mockingly. Helen ignored him. She was thinking about what Chen had said. Instinct, not calculation. She raised the weapon again, but this time she didn't focus on the sight. She focused on the target itself, feeling the weight of the weapon, sensing the distance. She squeezed the trigger. The rocket whooshed out of the tube with a burst of flame and smoke. Helen staggered slightly from the recoil but kept her footing. Downrange, the rocket struck the car chassis dead center with a loud bang. There was a moment of stunned silence. Then Lieutenant Morrison let out a low whistle. Beginner's luck. Load another one, Helen said quietly. Chen loaded a second rocket. Helen took a breath, centered herself, and fired again, another direct hit. One more, she said. The third rocket struck within inches of the first two. Captain Hayes's expression had changed from mocking to thoughtful. That's impressive shooting, Sergeant. Helen lowered the weapon and turned to face him. With respect, Captain, it's not about shooting. It's about understanding the weapon and trusting yourself. That's what we need to teach. For the first time, she saw a glimmer of respect in Hayes's eyes. Just a glimmer, but it was a start. That evening, Helen returned to her barracks exhausted but energized. The other WACs in her unit were preparing for evening roll call. How was your first day with the boys? Asked Private Sarah Jenkins, a young woman from Georgia who worked in communications. Challenging, Helen admitted. Sarah laughed. I bet they gave you hell. They always do. They think we're just playing soldier. Helen sat on her bunk and pulled off her boots. Her feet ached. Some of them do, but I think I changed at least one mind today. That's more than most of us manage, Sarah said. You're doing important work, Helen. Don't let them grind you down. Helen lay back on her bunk, staring at the ceiling. Through the window, she could see the lights of the base and hear the distant sounds of men training. Somewhere out there, across an ocean, a war was being fought. Young men were dying. Tanks were rolling across Europe, crushing everything in their path. But she had a weapon that could stop those tanks. A cheap, simple weapon that could turn ordinary soldiers into tank killers. She thought about Tom, about how he'd died in the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor. He'd never had a chance to fight back. But now, with this weapon, American soldiers would have a chance. They could stand up to the Nazi war machine. Helen closed her eyes and made a silent promise to her husband's memory. She would make this training program work. She would train these soldiers to use the bazooka effectively. And she would help win this war, one rocket at a time. No matter how many men doubted her, no matter how many obstacles they put in her way. She would succeed, for Tom, for her country, and for herself. The next 3 weeks were the hardest of Helen's life. Captain Hayes assigned her the most tedious tasks: cataloging ammunition, writing training manuals, organizing supply inventories. He kept her away from actual training sessions with the soldiers, claiming she needed to understand the administrative side first. Helen did the work without complaint. She wrote detailed manuals that broke down every aspect of bazooka operation. She organized the training schedule, coordinated with the motor pool for target vehicles, and requisitioned supplies. And every evening, after everyone else had gone, she returned to the range alone to practice. Corporal Chen often joined her. He was the only one who treated her like a real colleague. "You're getting better," he observed one evening, watching her fire 3 rockets in rapid succession. "You understand this weapon better than anyone I've seen." Helen reloaded carefully. "It's not about understanding, Mike. It's about respecting it. This weapon is simple, but it's not easy. There's a difference." Chen nodded. "Captain Hayes is starting to notice. I heard him talking to Colonel Bradley yesterday. He said your training manuals were the most comprehensive he'd ever seen." "He said that?" Helen was surprised. "He didn't sound happy about it," Chen admitted with a small smile. "But he said it." The breakthrough came in early May. A group of 50 soldiers arrived at Camp Kilmer for accelerated bazooka training. They were infantry veterans who'd be shipping to England in 3 weeks, then on to combat in North Africa or Italy. They needed to learn the bazooka fast and learn it right. Captain Hayes gathered his training team, himself, Lieutenant Morrison, Corporal Chen, and 3 other instructors. Helen stood at the back of the room, assuming she'd be taking notes. "Gentlemen," Hayes began, addressing the assembled soldiers, "you're here to learn how to kill tanks. The weapon you'll be using is the M1A1 bazooka. It's new, it's powerful, and it can save your life if you learn to use it properly." He gestured to his training team. "These men will be your instructors. They'll teach you everything you need to know." One of the soldiers, a sergeant with a thick Brooklyn accent, raised his hand. "Sir, I heard this weapon requires 2 men to operate. Who's gonna be my assistant gunner in combat?" Hayes nodded. "Good question. The bazooka team consists of a gunner and an assistant gunner. The assistant carries the rockets, loads the weapon, and watches for backblast hazards. It's a 2-man operation." Another soldier spoke up. "Sir, what's the effective range?" 50 yards for a reliable hit," Hayes replied. "Maybe 75 if you're lucky, but that means getting close to tanks that can kill you from much farther away. That's why this training is critical." A third soldier pointed at Helen. "Sir, is that whack going to be training us?" The room went quiet. All eyes turned to Helen. Hayes hesitated. For just a moment, Helen saw him considering his options. Then something changed in his expression, a decision being made. "Yes," he said firmly. "Sergeant Morrison will be one of your instructors. She's the best shot with this weapon I've ever seen, and she understands it better than anyone here. You'd be smart to listen to her." Helen felt a surge of gratitude and vindication. Hayes had just put his reputation behind her. The Brooklyn sergeant looked skeptical. "No disrespect, sir, but can she really teach us combat tactics? Has she ever faced a tank?" Helen stepped forward before Hayes could respond. "No, Sergeant, I haven't faced a tank. Neither have most of you. But I've spent the last month studying every after-action report from North Africa and Russia. I've interviewed soldiers who survived tank attacks, and I've fired this weapon more than 300 times. I know its strengths and weaknesses. I know what works and what gets people killed." She paused, making eye contact with the soldiers. "I also know that a cheap 13-pound weapon can destroy a 50-ton Panzer if the soldier using it has confidence and skill. That's what I'm here to give you." The Brooklyn sergeant studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Fair enough, Sergeant. Show us what you've got." The training began that afternoon. Helen started with the basics: weapon assembly, loading procedures, safety protocols. She emphasized the backblast danger, showing them burn patterns on wooden targets to illustrate what could happen to someone standing behind the weapon. "The backblast will kill anyone within 15 feet behind you," she explained. "In combat, that means checking your surroundings before every shot. A moment of carelessness can kill your own men." Then came marksmanship training. Helen demonstrated first, hitting stationary targets at various ranges. Then she had each soldier fire practice rounds under supervision. Most struggled at first. The weapon's odd balance and crude sights confused them. But Helen had developed a training technique during her evening practice sessions. She taught them to point rather than aim, to use their instincts rather than trying to calculate trajectory. Don't think, she told them. Feel, you know how to throw a stone at a target. This is the same skill, just with a different tool. Slowly, the soldiers improved. Helen worked with each man individually, identifying their specific problems and offering personalized solutions. Some were flinching from the backblast. Others were overthinking the shot. A few were simply afraid of the weapon's power. Helen understood all of it. She'd felt the same fears herself. One soldier, a young private named Tommy Reed from Alabama, was particularly struggling. He'd missed 8 targets in a row and was visibly frustrated. "I can't do this, Sergeant," he said miserably. "I'm no good with this thing." Helen pulled him aside. "Private Reed, can I ask you something personal?" He nodded warily. "Did you play any sports back home?" "Baseball," he said. "I was a pitcher for my high school team." Helen smiled. "That's perfect. When you pitched, did you think about the physics of throwing? Did you calculate angles and velocities?" "No, Sergeant, I just threw." "Exactly. You trusted your arm and your instinct. That's what you need to do here. Stop trying to aim. Just point where you want the rocket to go and trust yourself." Reed tried again. This time, instead of carefully lining up the sight, he simply raised the weapon and fired in one smooth motion. The rocket struck the target dead center. His face lit up. "I did it." "You did," Helen confirmed. "Now do it 9 more times." By the end of the week, all 50 soldiers could hit stationary targets consistently. Now came the hard part, moving targets. Captain Hayes had arranged for a decommissioned Sherman tank to be towed across the range by a truck, simulating a moving target. It was much more difficult than hitting stationary targets. Helen demonstrated first. She tracked the moving tank, waited for the right moment, and fired. The rocket struck the tank's side armor perfectly. The soldiers cheered. "Your turn," Helen said. Most of them missed their first attempts. Moving targets required lead time. You had to aim where the tank would be, not where it was. It was the same principle as shooting ducks in flight, but much more complicated with a weapon as crude as the bazooka. Helen worked with them patiently, helping each soldier understand the timing. Some picked it up quickly. Others needed dozens of practice rounds, but slowly, steadily, they all improved. The Brooklyn sergeant, his name was Tony Romano, became one of the best shooters in the group. On the final day of training, he asked to speak with Helen privately. "Sergeant Morrison, I owe you an apology," he said. "When I first saw you, I thought this was a joke. I didn't think a woman could teach me anything about combat. I was wrong." Helen nodded, accepting his words. "Thank you, Sergeant Romano. That means a lot." "I mean it," he continued. "You're a hell of a soldier. If I could choose my squad leaders, I'd want you leading mine." Helen felt a lump in her throat. This was the respect she'd been fighting for, not just acceptance, but genuine recognition of her abilities. "Just promise me something," she said. "When you get over there, when you face a real tank, trust your training, trust yourself, and come home safe." Romano nodded firmly. "You have my word, Sergeant." The 50 soldiers shipped out to England the following week. Before they left, they presented Helen with a gift, a photograph of the entire group with her standing in the center. On the back, they'd all signed their names. "To Sergeant Morrison," the inscription read. "The best damn bazooka instructor in the Army. Thank you for giving us a fighting chance." Helen kept that photograph in her footlocker. She looked at it every night, wondering where those men were, hoping they were safe. But her work wasn't finished. More soldiers kept arriving, needing training. The demand for bazooka teams was growing as the war escalated, and Helen was now officially designated as a primary instructor. Captain Hayes called her into his office one evening in June. "Sergeant Morrison, I have a proposal for you," he said. "We're expanding the bazooka training program. Colonel Bradley wants to create a specialized school dedicated entirely to anti-tank tactics. He's asked me to run it, and I'm asking you to be my second in command." Helen was stunned. "Sir, I don't know what to say." Hayes smiled, a real smile, not the skeptical smirk he'd worn when they first met. "Say yes, Sergeant. You've earned it. You're the best instructor I've ever worked with, and you understand this weapon better than anyone. We need you." "Then yes, sir. Absolutely yes." Hayes extended his hand. Helen shook it firmly. "Welcome aboard, Sergeant," he said. "Now let's go win this war." That night, Helen wrote a letter to Tom's parents, telling them about her work. She described the bazooka, explained how it could stop Nazi tanks, and shared the success stories from her training program. "Tom would be proud of what I'm doing," she wrote. "I'm helping our boys fight back. I'm giving them a chance, and every tank we destroy is a small victory for freedom." She sealed the letter and lay back on her bunk, exhausted but satisfied. Outside, she could hear soldiers drilling in the darkness, preparing for war. Helen closed her eyes and thought about the battles to come. She knew the real test was still ahead. Training was one thing, combat was another. But she also knew that her soldiers were ready. She'd given them the skills and confidence they needed. And when they faced Nazi tanks in the fields of Europe, they'd have a fighting chance. That was all any of them could ask for. By September 1943, the Allied invasion of Italy was underway. Reports filtered back to Camp Kilmer about bazooka teams in action against German tanks. Some of the reports were encouraging. Others were devastating. Helen read every after-action report she could access, analyzing what worked and what failed. She adjusted her training program constantly, incorporating lessons learned from actual combat. One October morning, Captain Hayes called an emergency meeting. His face was grim. "We lost Sergeant Romano's team last week," he said quietly. "Near Salerno, they destroyed 2 Panthers but took a direct hit from a third, all killed." Helen felt her stomach drop. Tony Romano, the Brooklyn sergeant who'd apologized to her, who'd become one of her best students, dead. "How did it happen?" she asked, her voice steady despite the pain. Hayes consulted his report. "They engaged at close range as trained, destroyed the first 2 tanks perfectly, but they didn't see the third tank positioned in defilade. That's a hidden position. It had a clear shot at them while they were focused on their targets." Helen absorbed this. So the problem wasn't their shooting, it was situational awareness. "Exactly," Hayes confirmed. "The bazooka is effective, but it makes soldiers vulnerable. They're so focused on aiming and firing that they forget to watch for other threats." Lieutenant Morrison spoke up. "Maybe we need to train 3-man teams instead of 2, 1 gunner, 1 loader, 1 observer." Hayes shook his head. "We don't have enough personnel. Every soldier is precious. We need to find a better solution." Helen was already thinking, what if we train teams to fire and displace immediately? Hit and run tactics. Don't stay in one position long enough for enemy tanks to target you. "That's difficult in combat," Hayes said. "Once you're in a defensive position, moving makes you vulnerable." "Staying still gets you killed," Helen countered. "Tony Romano and his men proved that. If we teach mobile tactics, fire, move, reload, fire from a new position, we give our teams a better chance." Hayes considered this. It would require more training time, more practice rounds, more fuel for moving targets. "Then we get more resources," Helen said firmly. "Sir, these men are dying because our tactics aren't good enough. We need to do better." Hayes studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "You're right. I'll talk to Colonel Bradley. We'll expand the training program." That afternoon, Helen worked with Corporal Chen to develop new training scenarios. They set up multiple target positions and taught soldiers to fire, displace 20 yards, reload, and engage a second target from the new position. It was exhausting work. The soldiers complained about the extra running and repositioning, but Helen was relentless. "Would you rather be tired now or dead later?" she challenged them. "In combat, the tank that kills you is the one you didn't see. Keep moving, stay alive." The new tactics worked. Over the following months, casualty rates among bazooka teams decreased significantly. Soldiers reported that the hit-and-run approach gave them confidence and survivability. But success brought new challenges. In December 1943, Colonel Bradley called Helen to his office. With him was a civilian, a thin man in his 50s wearing wire-rimmed glasses and an expensive suit. "Sergeant Morrison, this is Mr. Harold Webster from the War Department," Bradley said. "He's here to discuss a sensitive matter." Webster stood and offered his hand. Helen shook it cautiously. "Sergeant Morrison, I've been reviewing your training program," Webster said. "It's quite impressive. The Army is very pleased with the results." "Thank you, sir." Webster sat down, steepling his fingers. "Here's the situation. We're planning a major operation in Europe next summer. I can't give you details, but it will be the largest military operation in history. We'll need thousands of soldiers trained on the bazooka, tens of thousands eventually. Helen nodded. We can scale up our training program, sir. Captain Hayes and I have discussed expansion plans. That's not quite what I had in mind, Webster said. We want to create a training film, a comprehensive instructional movie that can be shown to soldiers at bases across the country. It would standardize training and allow us to reach far more men than your direct instruction ever could. Helen saw where this was going. You want to film our training methods? Exactly. We'd send a camera crew here next month. They'd film your training sessions, document your techniques, create a professional instructional film for widespread distribution. It sounded perfect. Helen should have been excited, but something in Webster's tone made her wary. What's the catch? She asked. Webster and Bradley exchanged glances. The thing is, Sergeant, Webster said carefully, the Army brass isn't comfortable featuring a female instructor in the film. They feel it sends the wrong message, that women are directly involved in combat training. The WACs are wonderful for support roles, of course, but combat instruction is. Well, it's traditionally a male domain. Helen felt cold anger rising in her chest. So you want to use my training methods but not show me teaching them? We'd give you full credit in the written materials, Webster said quickly. Your name would be in the manual in the credits. Everyone who matters would know the program was yours. We just have Captain Hayes present it on film. Helen looked at Bradley. The colonel's expression was apologetic. Sir, do you agree with this? She asked. Bradley sighed. Sergeant Morrison, I think it's wrong. I told Mr. Webster that, but the decision comes from above my pay grade. The generals want a man on screen. That's the reality. Helen turned back to Webster. And if I refuse, if I say you can't use my training methods unless I'm the one teaching them on film? Webster's friendly demeanor evaporated. Then you'd be putting your personal pride above the needs of thousands of American soldiers. The training film will be made regardless, Sergeant. The only question is whether it reflects your excellent methods or whether we develop new ones from scratch, which would take months and likely result in more soldiers dying with inadequate training. It was blackmail, pure and simple. Cooperate and save lives but accept obscurity, or refuse and watch men die while holding on to her principles. Helen stood up. I need to think about this. Of course, Webster said, standing as well. Take a day or two, but we need an answer by the end of the week. Helen saluted Colonel Bradley and left the office. She walked across the base in a daze, barely seeing where she was going. She ended up at the range, where a new group of soldiers was training. She watched them fire the bazooka using the techniques she'd developed. They were good, confident, and capable. Corporal Chen found her there an hour later. I heard, he said quietly. Captain Hayes told me it's not right, Helen. No, it's not, she agreed. But they're not giving me a choice. If I refuse, they'll make the film without my methods. More men will die. Chen was silent for a long moment. What are you going to do? Helen watched a young private hit 3 targets in a row, moving and repositioning between shots exactly as she'd taught him. That soldier would go to Europe. He'd face Nazi tanks, and thanks to her training, he'd have a chance to survive. I'm going to say yes, she said quietly, because this isn't about me, it never was, it's about them. She pointed at the training soldiers. Every one of those boys deserves the best training possible. If my methods can save more lives, then my ego doesn't matter. But they're erasing you, Chen protested. They're taking your work and pretending you don't exist. They can try, Helen said, but the soldiers know. Every man I've trained knows who taught them. That's what matters. That evening, Helen informed Colonel Bradley of her decision. She'd cooperate with the film production. Webster seemed pleased. You're making the right choice, Sergeant. The Army appreciates your sacrifice. It's not a sacrifice, Helen said coldly. It's doing my duty, there's a difference. The film crew arrived in January 1944. They spent 2 weeks filming at Camp Kilmer, documenting every aspect of bazooka training. Captain Hayes presented the material on camera, explaining techniques that Helen had developed. To his credit, Hayes looked uncomfortable throughout the filming. Between takes, he apologized to Helen repeatedly. This isn't right, he said. You should be the one on screen. Just do it well, Helen told him. Make sure the training is accurate, that's all that matters. The finished film was distributed to training bases across the United States in March 1944. Tank Killer, the M1A1 bazooka, became the standard training tool for thousands of soldiers. Helen's name appeared in the credits as Training Program Development Consultant. 4 words, easily missed. But something unexpected happened. Soldiers who trained with Helen personally began writing letters home, telling their families about the female sergeant who taught them to kill tanks. Those letters spread across America, and eventually, a reporter from Stars and Stripes military newspaper heard about her. In April 1944, Helen received a request for an interview. She almost refused, but Captain Hayes convinced her to accept. "The truth needs to come out," he said. "These boys are talking about you. Let them hear your story." The interview ran in May, just weeks before D-Day. It was titled "The Woman Who Teaches Men to Fight: Sergeant Helen Morrison's Secret War." The article described her training program, her innovations in mobile tactics, and her role in developing the Army's bazooka doctrine. It mentioned the training film and noted that while a male officer appeared on screen, the methods were largely Helen's creation. The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in from soldiers, from their families, from women across America who were inspired by her story. The Army brass was furious about the publicity, but the public loved it. Helen became, quite accidentally, famous. But she didn't let it change her work. She continued training soldiers, refining techniques, saving lives one class at a time. Because that's what she'd set out to do, and she wasn't finished yet. The real war was still to come, and Helen Morrison intended to make sure America's soldiers were ready for it. Helen sat in the operations center at Camp Kilmer with Captain Hayes and Corporal Chen, listening to radio reports from Normandy. Thousands of Allied soldiers were storming the beaches of France, beginning the liberation of Europe. Among those soldiers were bazooka teams, men Helen had trained personally, and thousands more who'd learned from the training film based on her methods. The reports were chaotic, heavy casualties, fierce German resistance, but also success. The Allies were establishing a foothold on French soil. "Bazooka teams are engaging German armor at Omaha Beach," a radio operator reported. "Multiple Panzer kills confirmed. The bazookas are working, sir." Hayes glanced at Helen. "They're using your training, everything you taught them." Helen nodded, unable to speak. Somewhere on those beaches, her students were fighting and dying. Every rocket that destroyed a German tank might save American lives. Every tactical maneuver she'd taught might be the difference between survival and death. She'd never felt the weight of responsibility so heavily. Over the following weeks, after-action reports filtered back from France. The bazooka was proving decisive in hedgerow fighting, the close-quarters combat in the French countryside where German tanks had previously dominated. One report particularly moved Helen. It came from Lieutenant James Parker, who'd been in her 3rd training class. "Sergeant Morrison's mobile tactics saved my team," Parker wrote. "We engaged a Panther tank at 30 yards, destroyed it with our first shot, then displaced immediately as she taught us. A second Panther fired at our original position 5 seconds later. If we'd stayed there, we'd be dead. Her training kept us alive." Hayes showed her the report. "You should be proud, Helen, you're saving lives." "I'll be proud when the war is over and they all come home," Helen replied. But not everyone was coming home. In July, Helen received word that Private Tommy Reed, the young baseball player from Alabama who'd struggled with the bazooka until she helped him understand it, had been killed in action near St. Lo. He destroyed 2 German tanks before a sniper's bullet found him. Helen added his photograph to a small memorial she kept in her office. Tommy's photo joined Tony Romano's and 16 other students who died in combat. She looked at their faces every day, remembering their names, their stories, their struggles during training. Each one was a personal failure in her mind, even though she knew rationally that she couldn't save everyone. In August, Colonel Bradley called her to his office with news that changed everything. "Sergeant Morrison, you've been selected for a special assignment. The War Department wants you in Europe." Helen's heart raced. "Europe, sir, in what capacity?" "The Army is establishing advanced training centers near the front lines," Bradley explained. "Places where soldiers can receive updated tactical instruction based on current combat conditions. They want experienced instructors to run these centers. Your name was specifically requested. Helen couldn't believe what she was hearing. They want me to train soldiers in Europe, near the combat zone. Yes, it's dangerous. You'd be within artillery range of German positions. But you'd be doing the same work you're doing here, just closer to where it matters most. Helen didn't hesitate. I'll go, sir. Bradley smiled. I thought you'd say that. You ship out in 2 weeks. The next 14 days were a whirlwind of preparation. Helen packed her gear, said goodbye to the wax she'd served with, and made final arrangements for the training program at Camp Kilmer. Captain Hayes would take over her duties. They'd worked together for over a year now, and he'd become not just a colleague, but a genuine friend. You're doing something remarkable, Hayes told her the night before she left. When I first met you, I thought you were just another whack trying to prove something. I was wrong. You're one of the finest soldiers I've ever served with. Thank you, Robert, Helen said, using his first name for the first time. That means more than you know. Be careful over there, he added seriously. Europe isn't like New Jersey. The danger is real. I know, Helen said, but those men need the best training possible. I have to do this. She arrived in England in early September 1944, then transferred to France 2 weeks later. The training center was located near Chartres, about 50 miles from Paris, which had been liberated in August. The facility was primitive, a collection of tents and temporary buildings surrounding a makeshift firing range. But it was functional, and most importantly, it was close to the front lines. Helen's commanding officer was Major William Thornton, a West Point graduate who'd lost his left hand in combat at Normandy. He wore a prosthetic with surprising grace. Sergeant Morrison, welcome to France, he said, shaking her hand with his right. I've heard great things about your training program. We need that expertise here. I'm ready to get to work, sir. Thornton showed her the facility. Soldiers rotated through for 3-day intensive courses, learning updated tactics for fighting in French terrain. Many were replacements fresh from America. Others were combat veterans needing refresher training.